September 14th, 1941. A gray autumn morning draped over a small provincial town somewhere in occupied Europe. The streets are quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hammering from the factory where the occupiers have commandeered the machinery. Leaves swirl across cobblestones in lazy spirals, and a cold wind presses against the walls of brick and stone like a reminder that no corner of this town is untouched by authority. Inside a modest schoolhouse, the air is heavy with the scent of chalk dust and old books. Wooden desks are lined in precise rows, and the blackboard at the front of the room gleams in the pale sunlight filtering through the shuttered windows. There's a strictness to the space now, a discipline enforced not by the teacher's hand, but by the invisible weight of occupation. The schoolteacher stands at the front, hands folded over each other, observing the rows of children with an attention sharpened by months of unease. These are not just students. They are names, identities that the occupiers have begun to catalog with precision. Each morning, roll call is no longer a ritual of learning. It has become a ledger of survival. The teacher's eyes flick to the attendance book, inked in neat columns, names carefully printed in the hand of someone who knows both history and its absence. A subtle shift in the air, a missing name, a hesitant glance from a child who had sat in that very seat yesterday, makes the teacher pause. The first absences are easy to dismiss: illness, relocation, a late arrival. But then there's the quiet pattern emerging, imperceptible to anyone else. Children disappearing from the rolls faster than any lesson can be taught. Each missing name is a small pulse of panic, a signal that something far more sinister is at work beyond the school walls. The paradox gnaws at the teacher. A system designed to track, organize, and educate is now a weapon wielded not in classrooms, but in offices where cold clerks tick boxes that determine life or death. The students file in, hesitant, whispering to each other, their voices hushed as if even the walls might betray them. One boy clutches his coat too tightly, sleeves pulled over thin wrists. A girl wipes at her eyes, pretending the tears are from the wind outside. The teacher watches, noting not just the absence but the tension, the tiny flickers of fear that ripple across young faces. There's a weight here that cannot be measured, not in books, not in numbers, and certainly not in lessons about arithmetic or grammar. Roll call begins. Names are spoken aloud, one by one. Jonas. Silence. Petra. Silence. The list continues, but the absences are too many, too consistent. The teacher's pen hovers over the ledger, ink trembling slightly, not from fear of discovery, but from the acute awareness of responsibility. Each signature, each tick is a choice. To mark a child absent is to potentially doom them. To ignore the rules is to risk immediate reprisal. And yet, there is no one here but the teacher and the children, no immediate authority watching. The classroom is both sanctuary and trap, a paradox that twists the gut like a cold wind. Outside, the occupiers move through the streets with their mechanical efficiency. Papers are checked, forms compared, names cross-referenced against registries. To them, children are numbers, parcels of potential labor or liability, mapped and cataloged like cargo. Inside, however, the teacher sees them as more than numbers. Each child is a story, a fragment of memory and hope, and each absence hints at a narrative of survival or horror that is being written in secret by those who would rather the world forget. The paradox becomes almost unbearable in its immediacy. Here, in this room of laughter-tinged whispers and chalk dust, the teacher is powerless to stop the machinery outside. Yet the classroom is the only front where subtle defiance is possible. A careful adjustment of ink here, a postponed mark there, a deliberate misalignment in the ledger. Small acts that ripple outward in ways no occupier can quantify. The teacher realizes that knowledge of the system is now a weapon. By understanding how the occupier's bureaucracy functions, by anticipating their obsession with rules and forms, it is possible to bend the ledger without breaking it. A boy at the back of the class shifts nervously. He whispers to the teacher, words barely audible. They came for my brother last night. The teacher nods, voice steady, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window, beyond the walls. Then we must make sure your name stays here, where it belongs. It is a promise spoken in soft tones, but it carries the weight of an entire invisible resistance. Every child saved becomes an act of quiet rebellion. Every ledger manipulated a tiny victory in a war that the world outside barely acknowledges. The morning stretches on, the teacher moving with precise calm, checking names, adjusting entries, observing faces. Outside, the sound of boots on cobblestone echoes faintly through the walls. It is the reminder that safety is temporary, that rules can be enforced with violence, that every ledger is a fragile lifeline. But within these four walls, there is a different kind of strategy at play. Here, courage is measured not in battles fought, but in the quiet defiance of someone who knows that a pencil and a careful mind can outmaneuver tanks and bureaucracy alike. The paradox deepens with each passing day. Those tasked with maintaining order, who believe that the world can be controlled with lists and signatures, fail to notice the subtle manipulations of someone they consider powerless. Teenagers with chalk, a teacher with ink, a few vigilant students. These are the ones who navigate the corridors of danger, while generals and administrators remain blind to the ingenuity hiding in plain sight. It is a quiet war, invisible to all but those who live it, and yet it carries consequences more profound than any open battle. By afternoon, the teacher closes the ledger, hands dusted with chalk, eyes tracing the last row of names. Each name represents a child still present, still counted, still alive. But each absence is a shadow, a reminder of what has already been lost. The weight of responsibility is almost unbearable. One mistake, one oversight, could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, the teacher knows that hesitation is a luxury this time cannot afford. Every day demands choices, strategies, and the courage to bend a system that has become a weapon against its own charges. As the children leave, filing into the cold streets, some glance back at the teacher, eyes wide with unspoken understanding. They do not yet know the mechanics of survival, the subtle tricks of ledger manipulation, or the careful calculations required to stay invisible. But they sense something vital, a protector in the midst of a system designed to erase them. Outside, the wind catches a loose page from the attendance book, carrying it briefly across the cobblestones before a foot catches it and returns it to safety. It is a small, almost cinematic reminder that survival is a matter of timing, awareness, and quiet ingenuity. The teacher stands alone for a moment, listening to the fading footsteps, feeling the hollow ache of knowing that each absence is someone lost to the machinery of occupation. And yet, beneath that ache, a spark persists. If knowledge can be weaponized, if bureaucracy can be outwitted with care, then perhaps there is hope. The ledger, once a tool of compliance, can become a shield. The paradox of the classroom is clear. In a world where institutions fail, courage and intellect survive in unexpected places. As dusk approaches, shadows lengthen across the empty desks. The teacher opens the ledger once more, tracing names with a careful finger, whispering promises that only the children will ever understand. The camera lingers on the blackboard, streaked with chalk and faint erasures, a silent testament to battles fought with nothing more than observation and daring. Outside, the town prepares for another night under occupation, unaware of the small resistance taking root in the quiet, dusty classroom. And as the door closes behind the last departing student, the question lingers in the air, heavy with history and foresight. How many lives will be saved before the ledger runs out of room? And how long can one person manipulate a system designed to erase them? Winter had settled over the town, a silence heavier than the snow that coated the cobblestones and rooftops. January 17th, 1942. The streets were lined with ice, and the breath of the occupiers rose like ghosts in the frosted air. Inside the schoolhouse, the classroom had become something else entirely. It was no longer simply a place for lessons in arithmetic or grammar. It was a command center for subtle rebellion, a space where survival required more than textbooks. It demanded ingenuity, courage, and the audacity to bend reality itself. The teacher moved quietly among the desks, the soft scrape of shoes against wood blending with the whisper of students seated in tight rows. Outside, the muffled thuds of boots and the occasional bark of a guard dog reminded everyone that the world beyond these walls operated on rules far more merciless than anything found in a curriculum. Inside, however, a different kind of calculation was underway. The ledger lay open on the teacher's desk, each name a living thread in a tapestry that could unravel at the smallest misstep. The process had become methodical. A careful erasure here, a rewritten date there, adjustment to attendance that mirrored reality only just enough to fool the occupying authorities. Children who had vanished in the night, taken, arrested, or simply relocated, were listed as transferred to distant schools, sick, or absent for reasons that could withstand scrutiny. It was a delicate choreography. One wrong stroke of ink, one hurried miscalculation, and the fragile illusion could collapse, exposing the children to the machinery waiting just outside the classroom walls. A boy named Tomas shifted in his seat, glancing nervously at the teacher. His father had been taken 2 weeks earlier, and his younger sister had disappeared during roll call one morning. "Will they come for me next?" he whispered. The teacher knelt beside him, voice low but resolute. "Not if we are careful. We will make sure your name stays here, safe where it belongs." It was not just reassurance. It was strategy. Each child was a variable in an equation that demanded precision, foresight, and constant adaptation. The paradox of the situation was sharp. The occupiers relied on bureaucracy, on meticulous records, and the absolute faith that ink and paper were infallible. And yet, in their rigid adherence to procedure, they had created a blind spot, a gap that could be exploited by someone who understood the system intimately. Knowledge had become power in a world where brute force often failed against quiet cunning. With nothing but chalk, ledgers, and a keen understanding of the occupiers' obsession with paperwork, one teacher could outmaneuver generals, administrators, and soldiers who believed themselves unstoppable. The teacher's office was cold, lit by a single flickering bulb. Shadows danced across the walls as fingers traced columns of names, shifting numbers and marks with careful deliberation. Each falsified entry was a heartbeat, each adjusted date a lifeline. The students watched quietly, learning not from textbooks, but from the act of resistance itself. Their lessons were survival, their homework the careful memorization of rules and loopholes. The teacher moved like a conductor, orchestrating the invisible symphony of defiance that ran beneath the eyes of those who thought they controlled everything. It was not without danger. One evening, a clerk from the occupation's administrative office had come to inspect the records, eyes cold and methodical. The teacher had smiled, offered explanations for every discrepancy, and presented evidence of compliance that satisfied the inspector, while every correction made during the day ensured that the ledger told a different story than the one the occupiers wanted to hear. It was a game of intellect versus authority, and the stakes were life itself. Outside, winter deepened. Families huddled in dimly lit apartments, ration cards clutched tightly, ears straining for any hint of who might vanish next. Inside, the classroom became a sanctuary of quiet heroism. Each child saved was a small victory, each entry rewritten an act of moral defiance. The paradox sharpened daily. The very system designed to enforce obedience had been turned against itself by one civilian armed with nothing but observation, intelligence, and courage. Even the children began to understand the stakes, though they could not articulate them fully. They learned to answer roll call with precise timing, to memorize fake absences, to carry fabricated stories that could withstand scrutiny. The teacher's instructions were subtle, embedded in routine and habit. Always arrive on time, but act as if you might not. Know your place, but let the ledger hide you. Survival was becoming a craft, and the classroom its workshop. A particularly cold evening brought news from the town's outskirts. Families reported that the occupiers were conducting house-to-house searches, compiling lists, cross-referencing names with school registers. Panic flickered among parents, but the teacher remained calm, eyes tracing the ledger one more time. Adjustments had already been made. Dates were shifted, names disguised, children relocated on paper before the search ever began. When the officials arrived at the school, the ledger appeared pristine, compliant, and utterly bureaucratic. Yet beneath the surface, it told a different story. The teacher paused for a moment, reflecting on the paradox at play. How could a simple classroom, a single ledger, a few quiet acts of resistance, outwit a well-funded, highly organized occupying force? The answer was clear. The occupiers had overlooked the human element. They had relied entirely on rules, on procedures, on the assumption that compliance was absolute. But they had never accounted for the ingenuity of one person who knew the value of small details, who understood that survival often depended on subtlety, deception, and the courage to act when all odds seemed impossible. By late afternoon, the classroom was nearly empty. The children shuffled out into the snow, their coats wrapped tightly around their thin frames, eyes bright with a mix of fear and hope. One girl, Anna, lingered at the door, glancing back at the teacher. Her voice trembled. "Do you think it will ever end?" The teacher smiled faintly, a mixture of exhaustion and determination etched across the face. "Perhaps, but until it does, we keep working, one aim at a time." In that moment, the ledger was more than paper. It was a map of survival, a testament to the power of human intellect in the face of systemic oppression. The teacher returned to the desk, ink pot in hand, tracing corrections with careful precision. Each stroke was a promise, each adjustment a lifeline. The room smelled of wax, chalk, and the faint metallic scent of ink, a perfume of resistance, invisible to those who would not see. Weeks passed, and the teacher refined the methods further. Patterns were analyzed, entries predicted, absences preemptively recorded. The ledger became a living document, evolving in real time to anticipate the movements of the occupiers. Students, initially unaware of the gravity of their actions, became complicit in the strategy, memorizing fabricated transfer dates, practicing rehearsed answers, and learning the rules of survival by living them. It was education turned inside out. Instead of teaching knowledge for knowledge's sake, the classroom taught cunning, vigilance, and moral courage. The paradox remained ever present. The occupiers, with their offices stacked high with documents, their clerks meticulous in their work, remained blind to the truth. They measured power through ink and paper. Yet it was the subtle manipulation of the very medium they trusted that determined life or death. A single ledger, a few altered marks, had more impact than any armed patrol, any policy, any regulation. And the teacher, who was supposed to be powerless, had become the linchpin of survival for dozens of children. As winter reached its bitter peak, the teacher closed the ledger one evening, hands cold and ink-stained. The room was silent, save for the occasional creak of wooden floorboards settling under frost. A fleeting thought drifted. One misstep, one overconfident clerk, one inattentive child, and the fragile web of survival could collapse. Yet, beneath that anxiety, there was a stubborn flame of hope. Each saved life was proof that even in a world dominated by brute force, intelligence, courage, and quiet defiance could rewrite fate. The camera lingers on the ledger, inked entries shimmering in the dim light, a silent chronicle of resistance. Outside, the snow falls thick and unrelenting, blanketing the town in deceptive calm. Yet inside, a quiet revolution unfolds, invisible to the world but monumental to those who live it. The paradox is complete. A teacher with ink and chalk outmaneuvers an army with guns and regulations. And the question hangs in the cold air. How many more lives can one ledger save before the occupiers notice? And what price will be paid for every clever stroke of defiance? Spring 1945. The snow had finally melted, leaving streets slick with mud and debris. The town breathed with a strange, hesitant energy. The war was ending, liberation had arrived, and yet There was an emptiness in the air that no victory parade could fill. Buildings bore the scars of occupation, shattered windows, blackened walls, and faded propaganda posters peeling from the bricks. The silence of the war-torn streets was punctuated only by the distant hum of military trucks and the quiet conversations of families emerging from months of fear and hiding. Inside the schoolhouse, however, life unfolded with a different rhythm. The desks were no longer just furniture. They were markers of survival, monuments to a quiet defiance that had saved dozens of children from oblivion. The teacher sat at the desk, hands resting lightly on the ledger, ink smudged and worn from months of ceaseless calculation. The ledger, once a tool of bureaucracy and oppression, had become a map of salvation. Each altered date, each carefully adjusted absence, represented lives preserved from the systematic erasure that had haunted every classroom for years. But the teacher's eyes held a weary sadness. Recognition was not forthcoming. Medals and honors would be awarded to generals, soldiers, and administrators. The quiet work of one person who had bent the system to save children would remain invisible, almost deliberately erased from the history that was about to be written. Children filtered into the room, older now, their faces etched with experiences no school curriculum could teach. They clustered hesitantly, some seeking warmth, some merely the comfort of familiar surroundings. Anna, Tomas, Petra, names once whispered in fear during roll call, now spoke with voices steady, yet still tinged with the memory of vanished siblings and stolen nights. They approached the teacher, carrying fragments of gratitude they could not fully articulate. Some hugged briefly, others lingered in silent recognition. It was a reunion of ghosts and survivors, stitched together by ink and courage.